Hello, I'm Andy Colvin, and I want to welcome you to the last session of the day for the Poland Oracle User Group Conference. I am here to talk about patching and upgrading databases in Oracle Cloud, a topic that definitely deserves a beer. So let's go ahead and get started. So I am Andy Colvin. I am originally from Texas, working 15 years for the Encatech Group and part of Accenture, and I've recently moved over to start doing Oracle stuff inside of Google Cloud. I'm very, very sad that I was not able to come be with you in person this year, but I hope to be able to be there next year or sometime in the future. So a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to dig into the differences between patching and upgrades with the console versus using the command line or the API. The specifics around database patching and database upgrades, and then dig into a little bit on troubleshooting, what to do, where to look when things go wrong, because it's not necessarily the clearest thing to have to try and sort out when you do have an issue. So first things first, this topic does cover specifically database cloud service, not the Exadata cloud service or Exadata cloud at customer. The operations, the commands, while maybe similar, are different. So this is specific to VMs or bare metal database hosts, either running ASM or LVM. All of these examples that I have for the code are up to date as of early September 2021, using the OCI command line package that's available through the OL7 developer repository, or you can pull it straight out through the Cloud Shell. So a quick discussion on terminology. The differences between upgrades and patches, while it may seem a little bit nuanced, an upgrade is something that changes the major version number. So going from 12.2 to 19 or 12.1 to 12.2, those are considered upgrades. Patches are moving within the same actual release. So those could be bug fixes, they could be security updates. For the example that we have, going from 19.9 to 19.12 is considered a patch for this sake. The RU is the quarterly release update. This also could include the RURs, which is the release update revisions that Oracle releases. These are basically patches that Oracle releases that include security fixes and other critical bug fixes that come out on a quarterly basis. One-offs are patches that are specific to fix an individual bug or a set of bugs. And then merge patches are sort of a set of one-offs that have conflicts based on the release update and are specific to a certain release update. So in a lot of cases, if you have a merge that's specific to, say, 19.9, you may need to get an updated merge when you apply 19.10. So we'll get into how to handle all those within OCI a little bit later, but specifically just thought it would be good to cover exactly what these terms are so that we're all familiar with it. So the most important thing to know when it comes to patching in Oracle Cloud is it's different than what you've done in the past. Anything that you've done on-prem, you've probably built out your own sets of scripts, your own tools, your own methodologies for doing things. Now that you're in Oracle's cloud, you will be doing things the Oracle way, for good or for bad. There's a lot that Oracle has done to make the patching process a little bit more streamlined, something that can work on multiple types of customer environments to be more of a general purpose type of patching approach. The trade-off with going from a generalized standardized approach is that it's not necessarily the most efficient method that would be tuned to your environment. So there are things that you may be looking at when you start patching in OCI, and you may say, this is a little bit slower than what we're used to, or it takes more time. That's part of the trade-off that you have with going with a platform as a service type of offering. The good thing is that all this automation has been done already by Oracle. So you can easily start to standardize, and they give you good tools that if you haven't done that before, you now have a lot that you can take advantage of. The other thing that's really important to know is that you will have times where the pre-checks fail or the patch application itself fails. And so you need to be able to know where to look to find out specifically what has happened. Otherwise, you're going to be relying on Oracle support very heavily, which is not really a good place to be, as a lot of our customers can all attest to. A couple of quick things that I've noticed is that from a file system perspective, you need to have plenty of space in opt and U01, because that's where the patches initially get downloaded from object storage and placed in opt, and then they get unpacked into U01. So if you were living tightly on space before, when you were on-prem, you need to be aware of that and give yourself plenty of room for those patches to be able to be downloaded and unpacked in those locations. Also, because you're going to have issues and you may run into problems during patching, it's really, really important to have a sandbox or a non-production environment that's in OCI that you can run a full set of patching tests against. The last thing that you want is for the first time that you're applying one of these patches and you're having to use someone else's automation, is for that to be going into production. That's just sort of it's a recipe for, you will regret that choice later on down the road, and you will end up with a sandbox environment. Moving on to talk about the console versus using the API or the command line, it's important to know that the console, while it looks really nice, it doesn't lend towards a scripted environment for releasing your patch updates. So it's really strongly recommended to move things over to using the API. So the primary way that most people interact with that is through the OCI command line utility. It's available through the Cloud Shell. It's a package that you can install on pretty much any Oracle Linux system, whether that's running inside of OCI or somewhere outside of there. And so you can interact from that point with all of your databases that are running in Database Cloud Service. So it's really, really nice, and it gives you the ability to sort of create repeatable tasks. There's also another utility that's on the instances of the database machines that is called DB-CLI. And that's sort of, it's a holdover from what Oracle used to do with the database appliance, that it interacts with an agent service that's running on the hosts themselves. And it can pull information additionally about jobs and what the status is on those. So that's something that we'll look at when we talk about troubleshooting. So that doesn't necessarily interact with the Cloud API overall, but it is another command line utility that you have to be able to diagnose and look at what's going on. Also, if you do want to write your own specific code, you can run Python and things like that against the REST endpoints for the Oracle Cloud API to be able to build out your own patching automation in your own utilities. So it's very, very extensible. It is something that you have at your disposal. Moving on to patching, it's important to know that there are two types of tasks that can be performed when you're applying a patch on the database systems. You have a pre-check and you have a patch apply. So the patch apply will perform read-only tasks that doesn't cause any kind of database downtime or instance restarts when it's being run. It does OPatch validation checks to ensure that you don't have any conflicts or any missed patches. It checks to make sure that everything can be safely applied, that there's plenty of space available for the system, and that it will be generally a successful run. Most of the time, if you run a patch apply or patch pre-check, then the apply will be successful from what I've seen. So it's important to know that the pre-check may very well create and delete a database home, depending on what you're trying to do if you're planning on an upgrade. And it's also good to know that the apply will always rerun that pre-check. Even if you ran the pre-check 5 minutes before, the apply is still going to go through all of those validations to ensure that there weren't any changes from the last time that it was run. So it gives you a safeguard that it will validate everything before performing anything that causes any kind of impact to the databases themselves. So you've got your database patches, which are applied to your database homes. If you are running a database VM or a bare metal system or rack, it will apply the grid infrastructure release update component, plus Oracle recommended one-off patches. And it's important to know that this list of one-off patches that will be applied with the release is not defined anywhere that I've been able to find from Oracle from a support perspective. There's no known note that lists out all of the specific one-offs that come with, say, the 1912 OCI database patch. If you really want to know what that list of one-offs will be, you can run the pre-check, and while the system has downloaded the patch and staged it into the opt Oracle OAK package repos directory, there's a metadata.xml file that contains the entire list of patches. So you can always sort of sneak that out while you're running a pre-check if you really want to know what all of those are. And so since that's not necessarily documented, it is possible for that list of one-offs to change, which is problematic if, say, you are applying the 1912 patch in the middle of August, and then you get around to applying it in production in September, just that you've gotten through your testing window and you're ready to apply it. There's nothing that says that that list cannot change. And so we have some ways around that with database system software images that we can discuss in a little bit. So it is really important to know that that is a list of the release update plus a few things. And it's also good to know that if you've applied patches in 19C before, you've probably seen the support note 555.1 that is the Oracle recommended one-off patches for each specific version of 19C that you may be running. Those patches that have been introduced are not necessarily in the list of patches or one-offs that get applied as part of the OCI database patch component. So you may need to apply those separately, which we'll talk about in a little bit. As I said, the database patches themselves only get applied to the database home. The database system patches is what Oracle calls the patches for the grid infrastructure home if you're running a database VM or bare metal that's using grid infrastructure. So those patches are completely separate applications for you to be able to choose when you apply. There's no more restriction from Oracle that grid infrastructure has to be on a newer release update quarterly patch set than the database does. So you can have those running at sporadic versions. So while it may not be the recommended approach, it is something that you can do. And so it's up to you to decide if you want to stagger the patching between the grid infrastructure and the database, or if you want to perform all those tasks at once. If you choose to perform all of them at once, you will have a longer maintenance window for while you're doing that. If you choose to break it up, you may have multiple outages depending on whether you're running single instance or rack. So it is worth noting. So when you choose, you can either patch from the console or you can patch from the command line. Patching from the console is as easy as this. You go into the database, you select updates, click on the three little dots over on the right, and then choose which patch you want to apply. And it will automatically pull down the specific Oracle patch. It'll run all the checks. And if everything's successful, then it will go ahead and apply the patch and finish up running data patch. So it's very, very useful. It's a pretty good process. It is not the most efficient, as I said before. It will take a little while to get it completed. So if you want to list the specific patch sets that are available to you, so if you wanted to list the release updates, and this is running on a database that's running 19C, so I can do this via the OCI command, either running from my VM or Cloud Shell or one of my driver hosts that I may have. And I can just say OCI DB patch list and say by database. I want to tell it what information I want to pull out of the table and how I want it formatted, because if I don't, then it'll just spit it out in JSON. which while it may be useful, it's a little bit easier to read if I've got it in a table. And then we have to give it the OCID of the database. And so in this case, this database for this example was running 19.10. And so we had the 1911 and 1912 patches available to us. It is worth noting that the OCI patching that's available to you only goes back a certain number of quarters. So even if I was running, say, a database on 19.6, I may only have the options to apply 1910, 1911, and 1912. And at some point, 1910 may go away when 1913 comes out. And so if you want to have the automation and the tooling to run slightly older versions, that's up to you through software images, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if you want to apply the patches for the database home through the command line, it's really, really easy. You can run the pre-check first, of course, just to make sure that everything finishes clean. And what that will do is it'll download the patch bundle, will run a bunch of conflict checks, and then it will delete the patches when it's finished. So that when you run the apply, it will go back and redo all of that work again. So just be aware that it will take a little while. There's no option to say, skip the pre-check or anything like that. So you need to be aware. So in order to do that, you just run the OCI DB command, say database patch, give it the OCID of the database, what type of action you want to perform, whether that's a pre-check or it's an apply. And the patch OCID is what we got from the previous command of listing the patches, or through the console where we can choose to copy the OCID of the specific patch. So if we want to check the status of a patch, then we can run, that's considered a work request from OCI's perspective. So we have to dig in a little bit and get the compartment OCID and the database OCID, and it will give us just the list of the specific work requests that have been performed against that database. So it doesn't give necessarily a lot of detail. In this case, we can see that one was a patch, and that was actually a prerequisite check that succeeded. And we have another that's in progress. And you can't, from the console or from the command line directly, get a whole lot of information about what it's doing. And we'll show you exactly where in the logs you might want to check if you're a little bit of a control freak like I am, and you want to see exactly what step it's in and what it's moving on to. There's one specific log that you can watch to see the patching process work through all the various steps. So the workflow that the patch goes through when you go to apply it, you will run, it'll stage, it'll run a pre-check, then it deploys, which is the process of actually running the patch itself. At that point, for stage 3 and stage 4 is when the database goes through the process of being shut down a few times if you're running on single instance. And so it'll apply the release update, it restarts it, it applies any one-offs that are included in the release from Oracle. And then after all that is done, as I said, it will automatically run data patch for you. And so it's a full end-to-end approach from Oracle that completes the whole process. So that's very, very useful for you. And it'll only run data patch in the event that it's necessary. If it's a DataGuard standby database, the workflow will not actually run through data patch because the database instance is either in read-only mode or it's just mounted. So it'll skip that part. So it won't have any kind of negative effects for you. So if you want to list the patches that are available to you for the grid infrastructure home, remember these are considered database system patches. It's a little bit different syntax, but it's still generally the same. We say OCI DB patch list by DB system, and instead of giving it the database OCID, we give it the database system OCID. So that's the overall OCID for the entire database system, as Oracle calls them. So if you want to patch the system via the command line, again, it's very, very similar to what doing a database patch is. It's just instead of saying DB database patch, OCI DB system patch, and it does the same exact operations of running a pre-check first, and then it'll run the apply when it's finished. And so it will roll through the entire process. It's completely separate and compartmentalized from what you have for patching a database, though. So you will have to do those completely separately. So if you're in the crowd and you've dealt with Oracle database patching before, you know that you probably don't just have the release update that you need to apply. If you've paid attention, you've got note 555.1, which lists out all of the one-offs that are recommended if you're running 19C and you don't want to be susceptible to all the bugs that Oracle's found as of this week. And so you will probably need to apply one-offs to your database homes. The trick with applying one-offs in OCI, there's no real automation or tooling from Oracle to automatically apply one-offs for you to an existing database home. So you're doing that just like you did on-prem before. And the other trick with that, because you do have automation for applying patches into the database homes with the release update, if you have one-off patches that are specific to the RU that you're on right now, that would cause a conflict with, say, 19.12, before you apply to 19.12, you've got to roll that one back, use the automation to put in 19.12, and then manually apply the new merge patch that's compatible with 19.12. So there's a lot more work that goes into it if you're going to use the Oracle provided automation functionality. And so it's not the cleanest thing to have to deal with. One-offs never are. And so it's just something that if you're going to go this route, it's something you have to sort of accept. That said, there is a better way to handle the patch releases and the software updates. Oracle is given the ability now to create what they consider gold images of database homes that you can take and apply to multiple database VM bare metal instances. And so that way you can create, say, if you've got 19.12, you can have your version of 19.12 that has all of the one-offs that are specific to your environment, that have all the patches as of a specific time, that go into 19.12 from the 555.1 note. And you can take that image, apply it to dev, apply it to UAT, and then drop it into production when you're ready. And you won't have any kind of configuration drift since you're in control of the specific one-offs that are applied in there. And so this is really the way to go going forward. Also, from what I've noticed, it's a little bit quicker. So that's always a plus. So you're never going to have a situation where you've got unexpected patches coming into play. It may take a little bit more time when you are building out your quarterly image. If you go through quarterly patching or twice a year, whatever that may be, building out what that image is may take a little bit of trial and error. It may take a little bit of time as you work through all the specific one-offs, but it will pay off in the end when you're actually going through the real maintenance window and applying those updates, that it's going to give you a consistent experience every time. The process of creating software images, this is something that you can do either from the console, as we can see here, or you can build it out using the command line. And so essentially what we do is you choose what your image will be and what release update it is. In this case, we've got 19.10. And then you can enter a comma separated list of all of the one-offs that you are specifying. It's important to know that when we say 19.10, what this will be is Oracle OCI's 19.10 with their recommended one-offs. And so any additional one-offs that go in are ones that you recommend. And so you may run into cases where there are conflicts and you have to request merges and things like that. But it's a really useful way to start. So to create this using the OCI command, for example, I can create a 19.12 database home. that includes these two specific one-offs. In this case, these are examples that are pulled out of the 555.1 node. I can say OCI DB database software image create, and notice that I'm not tying that to any specific database system OCID or database ID, because this software image itself exists outside of the database instance or the database system. It's something that I can take and I can, if I choose to, build a new database VM with this specific image. Or I can, if I wanted to upgrade from 12.2 to this 19.12, I can choose that as what I want to upgrade my database to. So it's really, really useful. And the only other thing that we need to tell it is the specific one-off patches that we want to put in. And so it's important to know, we'll find out sort of as this goes through, if it has any conflicts, then of course it will fail, but it bundles all of this together into a portable database home that sits inside the Oracle tooling and the object storage so that it can be pulled down at any time for a database instance. So it's really, really useful to be able to do. I also choose to leave wait for state available or failed in there so that my command, when I hit it, it won't come back until it's complete. This may take 10, 15 minutes, depending on the number of one-off patches that you have. It actually goes in, it builds the home for you and applies all these patches. So you'll know when it finishes, if you have a viable database home or if you have something that's not going to work, and you have to sort of go back to the drawing board and figure out where it may have failed. We'll talk about how to deal with that a little bit. So some things that are interesting that you need to know about dealing with these software images. First is that it will replace, if you're using the Oracle automation, it will replace your existing home when you apply a patch to this. So it will, if you were, say, using user 01 app Oracle product 19 DB home 1, when you apply the patch, even though it's putting in a new database home, it'll put it in over the top of the existing DB home 1. So that won't change, but you'll have the new home in its place. So you want to make sure that you've got backups, of course. It does take a backup of the database home before it goes through, so it won't leave you in really a messy state, but I wouldn't leave that to Oracle. I would rather trust it myself. So I want to make sure that I have a backup. Also, if you need to roll back, there is no actual rollback mechanism inside of OCI for applying the database patches. So if you decide a week later after applying 19.12 that you need to roll it back, that may be a manual process for you to have to go through. So plan ahead for that. It's also good to use a consistent naming scheme. I always name it with the version. And if we're versioning on, or you plan to, on 19.12, 19.12 v1, v2, v3 as you go through, or if you've got specific applications that have specific one-offs and you need to separate those out. If there are conflicts between patches, which does happen, especially even with the 555.1 note, certain specific 19.12 one-offs that are recommended don't go in together nicely. That will cause a failure upon creation, not when you're actually running the patch or trying to run the pre-check. So you'll catch that all the way at the beginning, which is a very good thing. Also, it's really important to know that you've got all the patches that you need included in there, because you don't have a way to add a one-off to an existing custom database image. So you have to create, if you say you've got 19.12 and you've got 6 different one-offs in there right now, you need to add a 7th. You have to go in and create a new software image that has all 7 of those one-offs. So it's not the cleanest thing to have to deal with that, but it is something that you need to be aware of. And also, you want to make sure that as you're moving up in versions, your next patch or your next software home is inclusive of all the patches that you currently have on your existing home. So, and I've got an example of this, but if you say have a certain one-off that's in your 19.10 home and it's not fixed in 19.12 and it's missing from your 19.12 home, then when you run the pre-check, it will fail trying to apply that patch because it says patch 123 was already installed. It's not in the new home. So I'm going to go ahead and mark it as failed. So it's good that it catches that early, but it does mean that you have to go back to the drawing board and rebuild that software image from scratch and include that patch that you had missed before. So if you want to apply patches with the software images, it's very, very similar to what we had before using the Oracle provided images. We really just add in, instead of giving it the patch OCID, we say database software image ID and give it the OCID of the software image. And it's the same thing as before, using the pre-check and using the apply. And like I said, because it's downloading the home and automatically doing the installation of it and just putting it in place, in my experience, this has been a faster process on the VMs and the systems that I've tested it on than doing a standard Oracle provided patch that's running OPatch Auto in place. And it's got some interesting stuff, the way that it works. They unpack the home first into a temporary place, and they run a DBCA command to compare the patches. And that's how they determine on the pre-check stage if it's going to cause a failure due to an inconsistent number of patches that were in there before versus what's in there now. And then once all that's complete, then it takes the backup of the existing Oracle home, wipes it out, puts the new one in, and attaches it to the inventory, relinks everything, of course. And then it's already got all the patches that we need applied. So it just needs to start the database up and run data patch when it's finished. So it's really, really, it's a much more efficient way of dealing with the real world challenges of applying patches in an Oracle environment. So now we'll move on to upgrades. Upgrades are something that nobody really likes to do. I feel like I've complained a lot about the patching process for what Oracle does with OCI. The upgrades are actually pretty well done. I will say that. So from a high level perspective, it follows a similar process as patching. It is a one-click, one-step upgrade. So it will apply or install the new version of the database software, whatever patch level you choose that you're going to apply. And then it does not use auto upgrade against Oracle's better judgment. They use the database upgrade assistant. But another caveat for that is that if you have data guard in place through OCI, if you have a data guard association, you do need to disable that or stop the data guard in order to be able to run the database upgrade through the Oracle tooling. So if you do have that in place, definitely check the documentation, open an SR with Oracle to see what they say on what you should do. It will prevent you from going through the upgrade process if you have it, but it is something that's not yet in place or ready. As I said before, running via the command line is very similar to doing upgrade or patches through the command line, where you can run a pre-check and you can run an upgrade step. You can either use the Oracle provided database software patches that come out, or you can use your own custom software images. So of course, before doing any kind of actual upgrades, you want to run the pre-check. What this will do is it will download either the software image or the Oracle provided patch set of the database home that you're going to be upgrading to. It runs a full installation of that to ensure that everything is good. It will run the DBUA pre-checks. When it's finished, it will actually delete that database home. Mostly. It's a discussion as to whether that's a bug or a feature currently between me and Oracle. Essentially, it'll download and install a new 19C DB home _1, and then it finishes and it deletes all the files in that directory and removes it from the inventory. It leaves the DB home 1 directory, and then when you go to run the actual upgrade, it creates it in DB home 2. I looked through to see if it was just a matter of the directory existing, delete the directory, and then see if it would create it in DB home 2. It actually didn't. It created it in DB home 3 and moved on. Inside the agent software that runs with the OCI instances, There's what I believe is it's an internal MySQL DB, and it has an incrementation that it's keeping of all the database homes that it's installed. And so if you keep running the pre-check, it'll keep incrementing that. And so even if the directories are gone, it's tucked away somewhere inside of there. And it'll say the last database home that I had was number 5. So now we need to install DB home 6. Oracle says totally expected behavior. They did that on purpose for some reason. I'd really rather not see just a DB home 6, but that's neither here nor there. So again, it's important to know that this runs the database upgrade assistant. It does not run auto upgrade at this time. So any kinds of pre-steps, post-steps that you want it to run manually that you may get out of running auto upgrade, you would have to build those yourself or plan those as part of your upgrade process. So when you actually want to run the upgrade, you can change that action from pre-check to upgrade. And what it will do is it will set a guaranteed restore point, which is very, very important when it's running the database. It pushes it over to the new database home, and then it runs the full DBUA upgrade suite. And again, just like we had before, we can choose if we want to upgrade with a specific version, say 1910, 1912, or if we want to go to our specific software image, which I would definitely recommend going the software image route if at all possible, if you can plan it appropriately. Just because that way every database that you upgrade will go to the same versions. You can plan accordingly, ensure consistency between all of your environments. So as I said, we have that wonderful little guaranteed restore point, which has probably saved anybody that's done an upgrade at least once. So in the event that, say, I go in and just do a kill 9 on PMON while the database is in the middle of upgrading, just to see what would happen, or if there's some kind of other failure that occurs, the upgrade will cease. The work request will get marked as failed, and when you go to check the database status, it will show it with this big nasty red box, and it will give you the option, as you can see, to roll back. And what that will do is it will kick back to the guaranteed restore points, bring the database back to the version of the software that it was on before, remove the new home from the version that it's trying to upgrade to, increment that counter again in the little internal database, and then the database will open back up. And this is something that I've tested with OCI a bunch of different times just to make sure that it works. And it does. It's something that I can definitely say you can count on in the event that you have that problem. But it is worth noting that the upgrade or the rollback function will only be available to you if the database upgrade fails. So if the upgrade is successful and say you haven't updated the compatible parameter and 2 days later you decide that you want to downgrade it, you don't have the ability to just go back to that guaranteed restore point, because at the end of a successful upgrade, that restore point gets dropped. But in the event that it did fail, you can do it from the console like I showed with the click of a button, or you can just say OCI DB database upgrade rollback and give it the OCID. You really don't need to give it a whole lot of detail, because all it needs to know is we've had a problem, take me back to the guaranteed restore point that I've already created. So the last little topic that we have to cover is what to do when things go wrong, because they will. It's what they do. So if you choose to sort of trust what's in the console, you'll be left wanting. And with the type of audience that we usually have at this conference, we generally want to know a little bit about why something has failed rather than lob a request over to Oracle and hope that they get around to helping us. So in really all of these cases for patches and upgrades, the console doesn't give a whole lot of detail to us. There is one particular log file that I am generally watching when I'm going through one of these operations, and that's the DCS agent, which is the the agent that talks to all of the Oracle Cloud services. And so you can see a lot for what's happening behind the scenes and under the covers if you watch this log specifically. There is a whole lot of noise that comes out of it, but you will see as it's going through and say downloading the newest patch and then unzipping it and where it drops it and all the commands that it runs, whether it runs opatch applies or it runs opatch auto, you can see all of those commands in here. So you can start to understand exactly what it's doing. So when you see that it's failed, you're not just throwing a request ID at support and hoping that they can dig into it and figure out what happened. You can start to say, oh, it's obviously that there's a patch conflict, or this patch is missing, or I ran out of space, or something like that, because the errors that you get in the console just aren't enough for you. So in the event of the failure of a patch that was applied in place, I got that error message that we saw before in the console that was just something happened. I don't really know what, and I don't want to tell you. I could either dig through that log file. This is also where the dbcli command comes into place. So we can first choose to list jobs, because essentially the database cloud service VMs are running like an Oracle database appliance. So on the ODA, you've got the ODA CLI. In this case, we've got dbcli. So we can say list jobs, and this will show everything that happened on this VM from being created to the database coming in to, oh, we ran a pre-check and it failed. And so now we've got a job ID. This is not an OCI ID. This is specific to the database itself that was run, and that internal MySQL database that we talked about. But so I can take that job ID and I can feed that. So I can take that job ID and I can feed that to the dbcli command again and say, describe this job. And I've truncated the output because the message itself tells us exactly what the problem is. But this pre-check actually goes through, and below this information, it gives us here all the individual steps that were run as part of this pre-check. Download the patch, unstage it here, run this test, go see what's happening here. And so there's a lot more information that we can get out of this than we can get out of, say, looking at the console. But quickly enough, we see immediately this was just a simple patch conflict. When we tried to apply the patch, we had some one-off that I had put in, tried to apply the Oracle provided quarterly update, and one of these patches caused us a problem. So then we can go in and start to dig in and see exactly where the problem is. We can either open a service request with Oracle, we can go dig through the OPatch logs to see exactly which patches are missing and which ones we need to update to or plan to pull out so that we can put the new ones in. But this gives us the ability to move forward with the problem rather than waiting for someone else to come and solve it for us. So this is a really, really useful utility. In another case with software image failures, this was when I was trying to take an existing software image that I had. I had this home already had the patch that ends in 346. That was one of Oracle's recommended patches that had been applied already. When I created my new software home, I didn't include this one-off. And so when I went to apply or run the pre-check, it came back and marked it as failed. And so the solution for me in this case, I could either go through the OPatch logs because that's where the failure occurred, or I could look in the DCS agent log because I was tailing that. And I can see in the JSON right there, specifically missing this patch ID. And so I knew that the new software home or the software image that I had didn't have all the one-offs that I need. And so in this case, the solution is to go recreate the new software image and make sure that I'm including this specific one-off as I go through, because I'm going to need it in order to be able to successfully complete my patching. And again, it's just really important to be able to know where your failures are and be able to diagnose the problems and know where to look. So those DCS agent logs, those are going to show you basically everything that happens from the patching perspective. The OPatch logs will give you anything related to applying a patch. In case you have a failure there, you can look in the OPatch auto directory. And then, of course, upgrades, since it uses the upgrade assistant, you have this CDB root Oracle server.log, which gives you, if there's a failure during the CDB upgrade process, this is the log that lists all 107 steps that are associated with a 19C upgrade. There are other log files in there. Of course, I would always open an SR with Oracle just because, especially with it being OCI. But I still wouldn't want to rely on them to perform all the troubleshooting that goes with that. I would want to be able to diagnose and resolve my problem first and foremost. And finally, I just want to thank everybody, whether you're in person, whether you're remote, primarily Camille, Louisa, everybody associated with doing the conference. I know how hard it can be to do online and in person. So the darkest days of my career, doing those with Enkatech, harder than any go live, any upgrade, any outage. Going through that is never easy. So I salute you. I have a nice Oktoberfest beer from my local brewery here in Texas. So I want to say thanks again. It is beer time. So let's go ahead and everyone have a lovely weekend, safe travels to anyone going home. And I hope to see you next year in person. Cheers.